All right, so today we're going to dig into something pretty major.
Yeah.
Special Counsel Smith's report,
Mm-hmm.
Volume 1.
Big one.
You guys have been asking us to really break this down, and I mean, this thing is,
Oh, yeah.
it's intense.
It is.
It reads like a political thriller, honestly.
Absolutely.
We've got excerpts from the report itself, and we're going to try to make sense of all the legal stuff and really get to the heart of what they found.
Yeah, and what it means for everybody, right?
What it means for you.
Exactly.
Oh.
I think one of the most interesting things is how Smith frames this whole thing right from the beginning.
Yeah.
He just keeps repeating this commitment
Yeah.
to the Department of Justice's nonpartisan traditions.
Right.
You know?
It's like he knew this was going to be a big deal.
He's like, look,
That's
we're not playing games here.
Yeah.
We just followed the facts wherever they led.
And according to the report, those facts paint a pretty clear picture of a scheme to overturn the election results.
Yeah, a scheme to overturn the election.
Not just complaining about it.
This is like a coordinated effort
Yeah.
to manipulate the entire system.
Think about that phone call to Georgia's Secretary of State,
Oh, yeah.
where Trump's basically saying, find me the votes.
Find me the votes.
Right? I mean,
It's wild.
it's almost unbelievable to hear that a sitting president
Right.
asking a state official to just create votes
Yeah,
out of thin air.
exactly.
And that's just one piece of it.
One piece.
They also talk about this
Oh.
plan to assemble fake electors in multiple states. Like
Right.
they were trying to
Fake elect.
bypass the actual voters.
Trying to circumvent the will of the people. It strikes at the heart of democracy.
Right. And we can't forget about the pressure on Vice President Pence
Oh, yeah.
to get him to reject legitimate electoral votes.
During the certification.
Yeah. Talk about a rock in a hard place, right?
Can you imagine
Yeah.
being in that position?
And of course, Pence refused.
He refused.
Which really says something about him.
Yeah.
Right.
Standing up to
Yeah.
his own party even.
And then there's January 6th,
Yeah.
which the report directly links to Trump's actions and that speech he gave.
Mm-hmm. That speech.
They're not saying it was just bad timing,
No.
right?
They're saying his words directly contributed to what happened.
They fueled the fire.
Fueled the fire.
And that raises some really interesting legal questions
Oh, yeah.
about presidential speech.
Yeah.
Free speech in general.
Right.
Where's the line?
Where does rhetoric become
Right there.
incitement?
Not an easy question to answer.
Not at all.
So let's talk about some of the legal hurdles that Smith's team had to deal with. I mean, this report is full of them.
Oh, yeah.
For example,
Like presidential immunity.
residential immunity.
The Supreme Court actually limited how much they could prosecute
Oh, wow.
for things he did while he was in office.
Okay.
So that must have been tough to work around.
It sounds like it, but they got creative.
Yeah.
They used this concept called the defraud clause,
Oh, yeah, the defraud clause.
basically arguing that Trump's actions defrauded the government.
By obstructing its lawful functions.
Yeah, like interfering with the election.
It's interesting because it's not like typical financial fraud.
Right.
They're saying that messing with the government's ability to do its job,
Uh-huh.
like running a fair election,
Yeah.
that also counts as fraud.
So it's about protecting the process itself,
Exactly.
the integrity of the system.
Mm-hmm.
They also charged him with obstruction of justice,
Right.
connecting that to his attempts to manipulate the election.
Obstruction.
And then there's the conspiracy against rights charge,
Oh, that's a big one.
which is all about protecting the right to vote,
The fundamental right to vote.
which is huge.
That one's particularly powerful because it connects this case back to the fight for civil rights.
Oh, wow.
It's a reminder that voting rights are something we fought hard for. They
Mhm.
shouldn't be taken lightly.
Absolutely.
So it's a hard one, right?
Now, I'm sure some people are wondering why they didn't go for certain charges,
Yeah.
like incitement of insurrection.
Mm.
The report actually addresses that.
Yeah.
They say they didn't think there was enough legal precedent
Right.
and that going for those charges could have messed up the whole case.
They didn't want to risk it.
Right. It seems like they were very strategic
Very strategic.
about which charges to focus on.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure they could prove what they had
Mm-hmm.
beyond a reasonable doubt.
They also make it clear why they felt they had to prosecute.
Yeah, they felt it was absolutely necessary
Right.
to protect the integrity of our elections,
Right.
to make sure power transitions peacefully.
Uh-huh.
They're saying this isn't just about one election.
Right.
This is about setting a precedent
Yeah.
for the future of American democracy.
High stakes.
Very high stakes.
But as you can imagine, things got even more complicated
Yeah.
once Trump was actually indicted.
It was a mess.
Right. And all of this is happening during an election year.
Oh, yeah.
which adds another layer of complexity.
A whole other layer.
The DOJ has all these rules
Yeah.
about not appearing to influence elections.
Right. They can't look like they're trying to sway things.
Yeah, so trying to navigate this case
Mm-hmm.
while being mindful of that,
Must have been so difficult.
it's like walking a tightrope.
A very delicate balance.
You have to uphold the law, pursue justice,
Mm-hmm.
but also be careful not to mess with the democratic process itself.
Exactly. You can't undermine the very thing you're trying to protect.
Right, and then there's the Speedy Trial Act,
Oh, yeah. That complicates things.
which demands a quick resolution.
Right. Justice delayed is justice denied.
Right, but then there were also arguments for delaying the trial.
To avoid making the political situation even worse.
It was a real tug of war.
A legal tug of war.
And then there's the chaos from Trump's public statement.
Oh, yeah. He didn't make things easy.
The report talks about all these court battles
Mm-hmm.
over his social media posts
Trying to control what he was saying.
and all the efforts to protect witnesses.
From harassment and intimidation.
It really raises the question,
Yeah.
can a defendant
Especially someone like Trump with a huge platform.
use their public image to influence their own trial?
That's a tough one.
Right? It makes you think about the limits of free speech
Where do you draw the line?
when it comes to legal proceedings.
Exactly.
And on top of all that, there were the battles over executive privilege,
Oh, yeah, that was a whole other thing.
especially when it came to communication between Trump and Pence,
Trying to sort through all that.
trying to figure out what they could even see.
Must have been a nightmare.
It sounds like it.
It really highlights this tension between transparency
Yeah.
and the need to protect certain conversations within the executive branch.
So as you can see, this report is so much more
Yeah.
than just a boring legal document.
It's a story.
It's full of drama,
Absolutely.
legal intrigue,
Intrigue.
and it raises some really big questions about the future of our country.
The future of our democracy.
We've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we've just begun to unpack all this.
There's so much more to talk about
So much more.
in terms of the evidence,
The evidence.
the legal arguments,
Mhm.
and the potential consequences of this whole thing.
What it all means for the future.
So stay tuned, because in part 2, we're going even deeper
Buckle up.
into the Smith report.
It's going to be a wild ride.
We're going to be looking at the specifics of the alleged scheme
Mm-hmm.
and what it means for American politics.
The implications are huge.
It's going to get really interesting.
Absolutely.
So don't miss it.
We'll see you then. Picking up where we left off, one thing that really struck me was how Smith kept emphasizing this idea of substantial federal interest
Oh, yeah.
in, making sure the law applies equally to everyone.
It's like they're saying, look, no one's above the law.
Right.
Not even a former president.
No one gets a free pass.
Yeah.
And they actually argue that prosecuting Trump reinforces that principle.
Interesting.
It shows that everyone is held accountable.
Makes sense.
They also make a pretty strong case that there weren't any other good options besides prosecution.
Okay, so what did they say about the other options?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, they point out that impeachment had already been tried,
right.
and it didn't really work.
It didn't address the severity of the situation.
Exactly.
So they're saying that just letting this slide would have set a dangerous precedent.
Right.
Like it could have undermined the whole system.
It could have jeopardized future transitions of power.
It's not just about this one election.
No, it's about the future of American democracy,
Yeah, protecting the whole system.
the very foundation of our government.
And to back that up, they bring in historical context,
Yeah, they point to other presidents who've been held accountable after leaving office.
like Nixon and Watergate.
Exactly. They're saying this isn't something new.
There's a precedent for this, and they tie this back to the right to vote, saying it's not just a state issue.
Especially when it comes to presidential elections.
Right, it becomes a federal issue.
Exactly. Because all states use the popular vote to choose electors.
For the Electoral College.
So by messing with the popular vote.
They're messing with the federal election process.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Another thing that really jumped out at me was how much the report focused on the extent of Trump's deceit.
Oh, yeah.
They used some pretty vivid examples,
Like what?
like how he kept pushing those false claims about vote dumps in Michigan.
Even after being told they weren't true?
Even after state officials told him directly.
Wow.
It's like he was determined to stick to his narrative no matter what.
Regardless of the facts.
And the report suggests this wasn't just a one-time thing.
Okay.
They present it as a pattern of behavior
A deliberate attempt to spread misinformation.
to overturn the election.
And they're not just talking about expressing an opinion or
Mm-hmm.
engaging in political rhetoric.
This was about intentionally using falsehoods
to disrupt a core government function.
To undermine the very process of democracy.
And they argue that even if Trump genuinely believed he won,
Which the report kind of casts doubt on.
right,
It still doesn't excuse his action.
like ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Exactly.
The report also sheds light on these individuals they call co-conspirators,
Oh, yeah.
especially co-conspirator 1 and 2.
It sounds like they were really involved in all this.
They were in deep.
They paint a picture of a group working together to achieve Trump's goals.
Using false claims of election fraud to pressure officials?
Organizing those fake electors,
Right.
trying to block the transfer of power.
And they even suggest that co-conspirator 2 knew it was illegal.
Yeah, they say he even admitted it to other lawyers.
Wow, that opens up a whole other can of worms.
About who else might be legally responsible.
Right.
And the report doesn't shy away from the real-world consequences of all this.
Yeah, they talk about the danger it posed to public officials.
Especially those involved in running the election.
Oh, threats
Harassment.
aimed at election workers and state officials.
The report says Trump's attacks directly contributed to that.
Created a climate of fear.
And intimidation.
They used that example of the Philadelphia city commissioner who got death threats.
After Trump called him out on Twitter.
That's scary. It's chilling.
And it wasn't just online threats.
No.
The report connects Trump's words to the violence on January 6th.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing to read how he encouraged his supporters to fight like hell.
And said they had to operate under very different rules.
Because of the supposed election fraud.
It makes you think about the power of words.
Especially coming from the president.
Right.
It's a huge responsibility.
Okay, so let's talk about the specific charges against Trump.
Right.
The report goes into a lot of detail.
Oh, yeah, they lay out their legal reasoning very carefully.
They clearly anticipated pushback.
Especially on things like obstruction of justice.
And conspiracy against rights.
They seem to have been very thorough in building their case. Like they were trying to preempt any arguments the defense might make.
Exactly.
And they addressed the fact that they didn't go for certain charges.
Like incitement of insurrection?
Which I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about.
Yeah.
They say those charges would have been too risky legally.
And could have weakened their overall case.
So again, they were being strategic.
Choosing their battles.
Focusing on the charges they felt they could actually prove.
And they stressed the importance of using established legal frameworks.
Rather than trying something new and untested.
It's about making sure the case is solid.
Okay, so one of the most interesting things to me is how they justify prosecuting Trump.
Yeah, knowing how controversial it would be.
Especially with the political climate.
They argue that it served several crucial federal interests.
Like what?
Protecting the integrity of elections. Ensuring a peaceful transfer of power.
Right.
Upholding equal justice under the law.
Okay.
And deterring future misconduct by people in power.
So they're saying the stakes were really high.
Incredibly high.
And they felt they had to act.
Even if it meant causing a stir.
They also talk about the fact that Trump had already been impeached.
Right.
And they argue that it wasn't enough.
It wasn't a sufficient alternative to criminal prosecution.
Because even if he had been convicted by the Senate,
It wouldn't have addressed the criminal conduct.
or served as a deterrent,
They also point to historical examples,
of presidents facing criminal charges.
even after being impeached.
So they're saying impeachment and criminal prosecution are two different things.
They serve different purposes.
Okay, so they acknowledge that charging a former president is a big deal.
Especially during an election year.
Right. They talk about how they navigated the DOJ's guidelines.
On avoiding any appearance of trying to influence the election.
So they consulted with the public integrity section
And documented their decision-making process very carefully.
to make sure they were following the rules.
Dotting their I's and crossing their T's.
And they point out that the 2020 election had already been certified.
Before they even started investigating.
So they couldn't be seen as interfering with the current election.
Right, they were looking at past events.
Not trying to sway the current political landscape.
Exactly.
They also talk about the sheer volume of evidence they had.
Interviews with hundreds of people.
Grand jury testimony from dozens of witnesses.
It was a massive undertaking.
And of course, they had to deal with those legal battles over executive privilege.
Oh, yeah, trying to get testimony and documents from people in the Trump administration.
I bet that was a headache.
It went all the way to the Supreme Court,
Wow.
which ended up limiting their investigation in some areas.
So even with all these hurdles,
They were determined to follow the evidence.
even with the potential political backlash.
They were on a mission to uncover the truth.
But the challenges didn't stop there.
Oh, no.
Things got even more intense once Trump was indicted.
With the election year adding fuel to the fire,
Right. They had to balance the need for justice.
with the need to avoid doing anything that could impact the election.
And then there's Trump himself.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly keeping a low profile.
He was using public statements and social media to make his opinions known.
Trying to control the narrative?
It's like he was trying to turn the court of public opinion into his own personal courtroom.
Exactly.
They talk about how he kept making comments about the case outside of the legal proceedings,
Sometimes even targeting witnesses and court personnel.
which must have been so frustrating for them.
They were trying to conduct a fair investigation,
And he's out there potentially influencing witnesses.
undermining the whole process.
They argue that his actions created a climate of fear and intimidation.
That threatened the integrity of the judicial process.
So they actually had to go back to court.
To get an order restricting his public statements.
It's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
You have freedom of speech.
But you also need to ensure a fair trial.
So the court had to find a balance,
They ultimately sided with the prosecution.
saying that Trump's statements were a serious threat to the proceedings,
They recognized that there are limits to free speech.
especially when it comes to potentially influencing a trial,
And they emphasized the importance of protecting witnesses.
from harassment and intimidation.
You can't have a fair trial if witnesses are afraid to come forward.
Or if they're worried about retaliation.
Exactly.
They also detail the legal battles over Trump's attempts to assert executive privilege.
Even though he wasn't president anymore.
It's interesting how the power of the presidency extends beyond someone's time in office.
It's a complex issue.
And they had to fight to get access to certain documents and testimony,
They argue that Trump's claims of executive privilege were too broad.
and that it was preventing them from getting the evidence they needed.
They were hitting roadblocks left and right.
So even after getting the indictment, they were still facing obstacles.
Just to get the information they needed to build their case.
It sounds like this whole investigation was a constant uphill battle,
It was incredibly complex and challenging.
full of legal and political pitfalls,
But the report gives us a fascinating glimpse behind the curtain.
of how the justice system works
And the lengths that prosecutors will go to.
to pursue justice
It's a testament to their dedication.
and their commitment to upholding the law.
Absolutely.
You know, it's amazing to think about all the work that went into this investigation.
Years of meticulous evidence gathering.
Legal analysis.
Courtroom battles.
And remember, this is just volume 1.
Focusing specifically on Trump.
Who knows what's waiting to be revealed in the other volume?
It makes you wonder what else they found.
There are going to be a lot of people waiting with bated breath for those future installments.
For sure, this is just the beginning.
So after going through all of this, I mean, what does it all mean for us?
Yeah,
This isn't just some historical document.
right.
It raises some big questions about, the future of our democracy.
Absolutely. It forces us to think about how fragile our system really is.
Yeah.
And how power can be misused.
Even at the highest levels.
Even at the very top.
It really highlights the need for accountability,
Oh, yeah.
right? Our system relies on the consent of the governed, and that consent can be undermined
Absolutely.
if our leaders aren't held responsible for their actions.
It's about trust.
Right.
Trust in the system.
Oh, what do we do?
Yeah. Where do we go from here?
How do we safeguard our democracy from something like this happening again?
That's the million-dollar question.
How do we strengthen our elections?
Right. How do we make sure the will of the people is actually respected?
These are questions that we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Not just lawmakers and legal experts.
every-
Everyday citizens.
This report is a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Democracy isn't a spectator sport.
Right.
We all have to participate.
We have to stay engaged.
We have to be vigilant.
So if there's one thing you want our listener to take away from all of this.
It's that the peaceful transfer of power is not something we can take for granted.
Yeah.
It's fundamental to our democracy,
It's the bedrock of our system,
and we have to protect it.
especially when it's challenged.
We can't let our guard down.
Well said.
Well, this has been quite a journey.
It has.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We've gone deep.
Deep dives indeed
To our listener, we hope this has given you a better understanding.
of this complex and important report.
It's a lot to take in,
It is.
but this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
Keep exploring these questions.
Talk to people.
Stay
The
engaged.
future of our democracy might depend on it.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Special Counsel Smith report.
It's been a pleasure.
As always, thanks for listening.